Wren Callahan buried her father on a windy Thursday with 9 people at the graveside, none of them wearing the blue and white of the Harbor Association her father had once been proud to captain for. That was the first thing she noticed, standing at the edge of the cliffside cemetery in the town she'd left at 18 and sworn never to need again. How few boats had bothered to sound their horns as the hearse passed the marina, the old harbor tradition for one of their own. 18 years of disgrace did that to a man. It silenced the horns at the end, even when the man in the coffin had spent every one of those years insisting, quietly, to anyone who would still return his calls, that the story the whole town believed about him wasn't true. Nobody had returned his calls in a long time, Wren included. She'd grown up on the official version, the one repeated in harbor bars and insurance offices alike for almost 2 decades. Silas Callahan ran the cargo vessel Meridian Star aground on purpose, collected the insurance payout, and let 11 crew members lose their livelihoods so he could walk away rich and hated instead of poor and respected. Wren had believed it the way you believe things about a parent you loved but never quite forgave, quietly, guiltily, without ever once asking to see the actual evidence. The retired investigator found her 4 days after the funeral, in the parking lot of the harbor master's office, holding a sealed case box like it might still be considered evidence in a case that had closed before she'd finished high school. Frank Delgado, the old man said, extending a weathered hand. I ran the original Marine Board inquiry into the Meridian Star. Or most of it, anyway. I retired the year after it closed, and I've had this sitting in my garage for longer than I care to admit. What is it? The ship's black box log, recovered from the wreck 2 years after the fact, once the salvage teams finally got deep enough to retrieve it. By then the case was already closed, the insurance already paid, your father already run out of every harbor on this coast. Nobody official ever pulled the full data off it. Delgado's jaw tightened. I always meant to. I told myself there wasn't any point anymore. I was wrong about that, and I think you deserve the chance to find out exactly how wrong. Wren turned the box over in her hands, 12 years of dust across the lid. My father sank that ship, Mr. Delgado. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows a version of it, the old investigator said carefully. Your father asked me once, the last time I ever spoke to him, whether I actually believed he'd done it on purpose. I told him I didn't know. I've regretted that answer for a long time. Maybe you'll have better luck finding a real one than I did. She opened the box that night, alone in her father's half-emptied house, and found beneath the black box unit itself a folder of his own handwritten notes, dated across years, increasingly desperate, the same careful boat captain's print he'd used to log tide charts her entire childhood. Not confessions. Questions. Timestamps that didn't match the official account. A name, underlined twice on the final page. R. Cole. Insurance filing inconsistent with recovered data. Ask why. Wren didn't sleep. By morning she'd searched the name that came up constantly across the harbor's public records for the last 2 decades, Vane Maritime Salvage, the company that had absorbed nearly every contract her father's old operation once held, its history page proudly tracing one family's rescue of the harbor's future after tragedy struck in 2008. Elias Vane, operations director. The caption under the newest photograph read, Marcus Vane's son. She hadn't let herself think about Elias in years. A memory surfaced anyway, unbidden, of 2 kids racing each other down the same dock her father used to captain from, before either family's name meant anything but summer and salt water. The Vane Maritime Yard hadn't changed its bones in 18 years, even with a new sign, and a fleet twice the size Wren remembered. The same corrugated boathouses, the same smell of diesel and rope, the same long piers stretching into water her father used to know better than his own hands. She'd barely parked before a man came striding down the dock toward her, tall, sun-weathered, controlled in the specific way of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation for exactly this occasion. You must be Wren Callahan, Elias Vane said, and it wasn't a greeting. Delgado called ahead. Said you'd probably show up asking questions about a case that's been closed longer than you've had a driver's license. It's not as closed as everyone keeps insisting. My father built this company out of the wreckage your father left behind, Elias said, voice low and even, the sound of a man who'd clearly imagined saying this to her for a long time. 11 men lost their boats, their contracts, their whole livelihoods because Silas Callahan needed a payout more than he needed to keep this harbor's word. I'm not interested in reopening that wound so his daughter can feel better about the inheritance she's about to lose too. Something in Wren went very still, then very hot. My father spent the rest of his life saying he tried to turn that ship back. Everyone laughed at him for it, including me, until 4 days ago. She held his gaze, refusing to be the one to look away first. The recovered black box log says the same thing, Mr. Vane. So did his private notes. Somebody underlined a name in there I don't think either of us has looked at closely enough, because I don't think it was my father who sank that ship at all. Elias didn't answer right away. Something flickered behind his eyes instead. Not doubt exactly. Not yet. But the first hairline crack in a legacy he had built his entire adult life defending. My father is sick, he said finally, quieter now. I'm not going to drag him through some reopened inquiry based on notes a dead man wrote to make himself feel better. Then don't drag him through it, Wren said. Ask him yourself, when you're ready. Ask him what he actually remembers about the year the Meridian Star went down. Because I think, Mr. Vane, we've both spent 18 years mourning the wrong version of our fathers. She turned back toward her car before he could answer, the black box case heavy in her arms, hands unsteady on the wheel the entire drive back to the house she was supposed to be emptying, not filling with new, impossible questions. And behind her, at the end of the long pier his grandfather had built, Elias Vane stood staring after her, with the uncomfortable, unwelcome sense that the water beneath his family's entire legacy had just gone a great deal deeper than he'd ever let himself look. The port authorities' letter arrived at both houses on the same morning, which was, Wren would later think, the only fair thing about any of it. She read hers standing in her father's kitchen, the black box case still sitting on the table where she'd left it 3 nights ago, sleep still catching up to her in fragments. The letter was formal, dense with clauses, and buried on its second page was the sentence that would end up mattering more than anything else in it, due to a reopened inquiry referencing contested salvage rights along the North Pier. The Port Authority's licensing renewal for Vane Maritime Salvage will require a joint operational review, conducted by both claimants, prior to final approval. 30 days. Both claimants present. Signed off by both names. He built a trap, Wren said aloud, to the empty kitchen, the same disbelieving laugh from 4 days ago rising up again. He couldn't fix it himself while he was alive, so he wrote a case file heavy enough to force someone else into fixing it after he was gone. Elias's reaction, when the Port Authority's compliance officer delivered the same letter to the Vane Maritime office that afternoon, was considerably less composed. 30 days, he repeated, staring at the page like it might rearrange itself into something less absurd. 30 days, during our busiest salvage season in a decade, and I'm supposed to hand a woman I've known for 4 days a working stake in contract review because her father wrote suspicious notes before he died? Your father is a named guarantor on the original harbor contract, the compliance officer said mildly. He co-signed the salvage rights transfer himself, Mr. Vane, the year after the Meridian Star went down. Whatever reason the board has for reopening this, it wasn't only Ms. Callahan's doing. That stopped Elias cold. My father co-signed a transfer tied to an active inquiry? 18 years ago. I'd suggest asking him why, rather than asking me. Elias didn't ask him. Not yet. Some part of him, the part that had spent his whole life being told a clean, simple story about a good captain who'd saved a harbor's fortunes from a reckless man's greed, wasn't ready to find out the story had never been that simple at all. He drove to the Callahan house instead, because confronting Wren felt safer than confronting his father, and found her on the porch steps sorting through a box of old harbor photographs, faces from a childhood she'd apparently spent 18 years trying not to remember. 30 days, he said, without greeting, holding up his copy of the letter like evidence. You knew about this. I found out an hour before you did. Believe that or don't. She didn't look up from the photograph in her hand. 2 kids racing down a dock, unmistakably a younger Elias and someone who had to be his older brother, and a girl Wren recognized, with an unpleasant jolt, as herself. I didn't ask for a licensing dispute, Mr. Vane. I asked a question about a wreck. The Port Authority is the one who decided the answer required 30 days of both of us pretending to run a joint review together. I don't have time to babysit an inquiry during peak salvage season. Then don't babysit it. Work it, like the letter requires, and prove there's nothing here worth reopening. That should be easy for you if you're as certain of your version of events as you keep insisting you are. The challenge in her voice landed exactly where she meant it to. Elias's jaw tightened, and for a moment Wren watched him war with himself, the easy version of anger he'd walked in with, and something more complicated underneath it, a man who had built his entire identity on being his father's redemption story and didn't know what he was without it fully intact. Fine, he said finally. 30 days. You review the peer contracts alongside our operations manager, you stay out of active salvage jobs, and this ends the moment the board signs off. This is not a negotiation about blame. It's a countdown until you go back to whatever life you actually have. Careful, Mr. Vane, Wren said, standing, meeting him at eye level for the first time since the dock. You almost sound like a man worried he might lose the argument. He didn't have an answer for that, which told her more than any answer would have. That evening, back at the Vane Maritime Yard, Elias found his father in the small office overlooking the boathouse, the one Marcus had retreated to more and more since his diagnosis, an old marine radio, humming static on a shelf nobody else in the building still used. You co-signed the salvage transfer, Elias said, without preamble, the year after the wreck. Why would you do that if Silas Callahan really did what everyone says he did? Marcus's hand stilled on the arm of his chair. For just a moment, brief enough that Elias almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, something like fear crossed his father's face, old and buried, and clearly rehearsed for exactly this question, arriving 18 years later than Marcus had probably hoped it would. Because the harbor board asked me to, Marcus said finally, carefully. Because some debts you carry your whole life, even when you can't explain them to your own son. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have tonight. Marcus turned back to the window, and Elias recognized, with a discomfort he wasn't ready to sit with, the exact same posture Wren had described her own father wearing for 18 years, a man guarding a silence that had cost him more than anyone around him understood. Give her the 30 days, Elias. Whatever you think of Silas's daughter, that man earned more from this family than we ever gave him, and so, I think, did you, though you don't know it yet. Elias left the office without pressing further, because some part of him, quiet, unwelcome, growing louder by the hour, had already started to suspect that the story he'd built his whole adult life on top of was standing on far less solid ground than he'd been told. Outside, the harbor stretched dark and quiet toward the breakwater, 30 days from the licensing board's final decision, and somewhere in that countdown neither Elias nor Wren yet realized they were about to discover far more than which one of their fathers had told the truth. The marine engineer Wren hired worked out of a cluttered lab 2 towns over, the kind of place that smelled like solder and old coffee, and he called her 4 days into the review with a voice that had lost its professional distance entirely. You need to come look at this yourself, he said. I don't want to summarize it over the phone and have you think I'm exaggerating. She drove there straight from the Vane Maritime Yard, still in her borrowed hard hat from the morning's contract walkthrough, and found him hunched over 3 monitors, the black box data finally decoded into something readable after 18 years of sitting untouched in Delgado's garage. Here, he said, pointing to a line of timestamp helm data. 90 seconds before impact, someone throws the wheel hard to port. Full rudder, emergency correction, exactly what you'd do if you were trying to turn a ship away from a shoal, not into one. He scrolled further. And here, 30 seconds later, the helm angle reverses. Someone straightens it back out, dead center, on a collision course with the rocks. Wren stared at the screen, her father's name suddenly attached to numbers instead of rumors for the first time in 18 years. That doesn't make sense. If he corrected the course, why would it reverse? That's the question I can't answer from data alone, the engineer said. Either your father changed his mind in the middle of an emergency maneuver, which happens to no captain I've ever heard of, or somebody else had access to that helm in the final 90 seconds and undid what he was trying to do. She sat with that in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she could make herself drive anywhere, her hands shaking around the printed data sheets, 18 years of shame cracking open into something that felt almost more frightening than the shame had been. The possibility that her father had spent the rest of his life trying to save a ship somebody else had already decided to sink. She found Elias at the yard that evening, alone in the boathouse office, going through decades-old contract files with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been avoiding a conversation with his own father for 4 days by drowning himself in paperwork instead. "I need you to look at something," she said, setting the printed helm data on the desk between them without preamble. Elias looked at it warily, the way he'd looked at everything she'd brought into his life so far. More notes. The black box data. Properly analyzed this time. She pushed it toward him. "Read the timestamps around the 90-second mark. Please." He read slowly, and Wren watched something shift across his face as he did. The careful composure he'd been wearing like armor since the dock cracking, just slightly at the edges. When he reached the reversal in the helm angle, his hand went still on the page. "Somebody else was on that bridge," he said quietly. "Or somebody accessed the helm remotely, or overrode it some other way. I don't know yet. But it wasn't one continuous decision by one man. My father's own notes underlined a name, R. Cole. Ask why." Wren sat down across from him. "Do you know who that is?" Elias exhaled slowly. "Renata Cole. She underwrote the Meridian Star's insurance policy. She's worked the harbor's marine coverage for almost 30 years. She still consults for half the boats in this yard. I never had any reason to doubt her." "Did you ever ask your father directly?" "Not the insurance report. Him." Elias didn't answer right away, and that silence told her everything the data hadn't. "No," he admitted finally. "It was easier to let the official inquiry carry the story. He never seemed to want to talk about that year, and I never made him." Wren felt some of the fight drain out of her posture now that she wasn't fighting alone in the room. "My father wrote something else further down the page. He said he didn't think your father actually believed the official story either. Said he saw fear in Marcus's face, not anger, the last time they ever spoke." She looked up at Elias. "What if neither of our fathers did this to each other? What if someone did it to both of them?" Something in the room went very quiet. Outside the window, the harbor stretched dark and glittering toward the breakwater, 18 years of two families' history sitting on the same water that had apparently also swallowed a truth neither of them had built. "I remember them," Elias said suddenly, unprompted, staring at the data rather than at her. "Your father and mine. Before all this. I must have been 8, maybe 9. I remember them laughing over something on this exact dock, some joke about a storm they'd both ridden out together, and my father had his arm around your father's shoulders like they'd known each other their whole lives, which I suppose they had." He looked up at her, something unguarded in his face for the first time since she'd arrived at the yard. "I'd forgotten that until just now. I don't know why I forgot it. Because it was easier to hate a version of him that made sense of everything you lost," Wren said quietly. "I did the same thing. It's easier to be angry at a man for a choice he made than to wonder if someone else made the choice for him." They sat with that for a long moment, the printed data between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to need. Elias closed the folder gently, careful with the fragile pages, and slid it back toward her. "I need to talk to my father," he said. "Really talk to him. Not the version of the conversation I've been avoiding for 4 days. I'll come with you if you want. Or I'll stay away, if that's easier for him." Wren stood, gathering the data back into her bag. "I just need to know the truth, Elias. Whatever it costs either of our families to get there." "So do I," Elias said, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the yard's gates, it didn't sound like an accusation aimed at her. It sounded like a man finally asking the same question she'd been asking her whole life, and meaning it. Marcus Vane had built a life out of not answering questions, and Elias had spent 32 years mistaking that silence for strength. He tried again 2 days after reading the black box data, catching his father in the boathouse office during the one quiet hour before the crew came in for the morning's storm damage assessment. A late-season squall had torn through the harbor overnight, snapping 2 mooring lines and dragging a client's sailboat halfway onto the rocks near the North Pier. The kind of chaos that usually gave Marcus an easy excuse to disappear into logistics instead of conversation. Elias didn't let him this time. He set a printed page of the helm data on the desk, the 90-second reversal circled in red pen, and watched his father's face change before he'd even finished sitting down. "Where did this come from?" Marcus said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, winded, like a man absorbing a blow he'd been braced for so long he'd almost convinced himself it would never land. Wren had the black box properly analyzed. Someone else was on that helm in the final 90 seconds, Papa. Somebody undid whatever Silas Callahan was trying to do. Elias's voice had none of its usual composure now. "You co-signed a salvage transfer tied to an active inquiry the year after the wreck. What did you actually know?" Marcus didn't answer. He turned toward the window instead, the harbor gray and choppy from the previous night's storm, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the distant clank of rigging against a dozen masts. "Papa, I need you to understand something first," Marcus said finally, and his voice had gone thin, aged in a way Elias hadn't noticed happening in real time. "This company was drowning before either of us knew it. Renata handled the marine insurance for your grandfather for almost 20 years before any of us ever dealt with her directly. By the time Silas and I were running our own operations side by side, the coverage on half our contracts was already irregular, in ways neither of us understood yet." "What kind of irregular?" "Policies written against vessels that didn't match their filed values. Payouts structured in ways that made no sense unless you assumed someone intended a loss before it happened." Marcus's hands had started to shake, faintly, the tremor of illness or memory, or both at once. Silas was the one who wanted to dig deeper, bring in an outside auditor, expose whatever Renata was doing before it sank us both, literally or otherwise. "She came to me first," said. "If Silas kept asking questions, the Marine Board would find both our companies attached to years of coverage neither of us fully understood, and that the only way to protect both families was for one of us to quietly step back and let her manage the fallout from the Meridian Star herself. And you let her convince you that meant letting Silas take the entire blame for a wreck he tried to prevent." "I didn't know that's what it meant until it was already done." For the first time since Elias had confronted him, Marcus turned to look at his son directly, and what was in his face wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to grief, decades old, finally given permission to surface. By the time I understood the scope of what her silence was actually protecting, Silas had already been run out of every harbor on this coast, already telling anyone who'd listened that he'd tried to turn that ship back, and nobody believed him because the official inquiry had already closed around a story that made him the villain. I let him carry that alone for 18 years because admitting the truth felt like admitting I'd let my own oldest friend take a fall that was never his to take. Elias sat with that for a long moment, the harbor gray and restless outside the window. "Renata still handles half this company's coverage, Papa. She was at the licensing renewal meeting last month, sitting across from me like she has every right to be there." "I know," Marcus said quietly, and something in his voice now sounded less like guilt and more like fear. "I've known for years I should have moved every policy this company holds away from her entirely, and every year I found a reason not to, because looking at her too closely meant looking at what I did too closely along with it." Elias stood, the printed data heavy in his hands, and for once didn't know which fire to put out first. 18 years of his family's public story collapsing, or the sudden, urgent understanding that the woman still underwriting the harbor's biggest contracts might have far more at stake in keeping this town's silence intact than either he or Wren had yet realized. He found her an hour later on the storm-damaged pier, coordinating with 2 of the yard's line crew to secure the sailboat the previous night's squall had dragged onto the rocks, her sleeves rolled and her boots soaked through, working with the unhurried focus of someone who had, against every instinct she'd arrived with, started to actually care about this harbor's survival. She looked up when she saw his face and waved the crew back, giving them room. "You talked to him," she said. It wasn't a question either. He confirmed most of it. Not deliberate sabotage by my father, worse in a way. A forced silence, orchestrated by Renata Cole, built on both our father's fear of an insurance audit neither of them fully understood. Elias's voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not anger this time, something closer to grief for a version of his family he was only now allowed to mourn properly. She's still involved in this harbor's business, Wren.
Right now. Today.
She sat across from me at the licensing meeting like she has every right to be there. Wren felt something cold settle in her chest, the storm-gray water lapping against the pilings beneath them. Then whatever she did 18 years ago, it worked well enough that she never had to stop. They stood together at the edge of the damaged pier, gulls circling low over the wreckage of the previous night's storm, both of them now carrying a version of the truth heavier than either had walked into this harbor with. "I owe you an apology," Elias said finally. "For the dock. For assuming the worst version of your father, because it was easier than questioning the story I'd been handed my whole life." "You don't owe me anything yet," Wren said, not unkindly. "Not until we know exactly what Renata's still protecting, and why. Because if she orchestrated this once to save herself, Elias. I don't think 30 days and a licensing review is going to stop her from doing whatever she needs to do to keep protecting it now." Elias looked out over the harbor, his whole life, his father's whole guilt, 2 decades of 2 families' history, all of it floating on water that had quietly kept moving over a lie for 18 years without anyone noticing the current underneath. "Then we don't have 30 days, he said. "We have however long it takes her to realize we're getting close, and then we have whatever time is left after that." By the 18th night, exhaustion had stopped feeling like something to fight and started feeling like the only honest state either of them had left. They'd stayed late aboard the salvage boat, finishing an inventory of recovered mooring hardware that should have taken an hour and had somehow stretched into most of the evening, neither one in any particular hurry to head back to the dock. The cabin's single work lamp threw a small, warm circle of light across the chart table, and beyond it the harbor had gone fully dark, the kind of quiet that makes 2 tired people forget, for a while, all the careful reasons they've been keeping their distance. "You're doing it again," Elias said, watching her log the last few items with more precision than the task required. "Doing what?" "Rushing through the parts that actually matter, so you don't have to sit inside them." He said it without edge, the way he'd started saying most things to her now, direct, but not looking to wound. "You've cataloged 40 pieces of scrap hardware like your life depends on getting the serial numbers exactly right, and you haven't said one real thing all night." Wren's pen stilled over the page. "Maybe I'm tired of real things costing me something every time I let one out. I know that feeling better than you'd think." Elias leaned back against the cabin wall, and in the low light he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, less like a man defending his father's legacy and more like someone simply exhausted by carrying it. "I keep telling myself this review is about the harbor, the licensing board, my father's health. I keep making a list of reasons this is complicated, so I don't have to say the actual complicated thing." "What's the actual thing?" "That I've spent 18 days waiting for you to walk onto this dock, and I don't know what to do with that. Because you're supposed to be the one complication in my life, I have a good reason to keep at arm's length." His voice had dropped, rough now, unguarded in a way she'd never heard from him. "And instead I keep finding reasons to stand closer." Wren's breath caught. The logbook was forgotten now, set aside somewhere neither of them tracked, and the space between them had thinned the way it does right before 2 people stop pretending there's a reason to keep it. She could feel the pull of it, old and simple and entirely uncomplicated by inquiries or insurance files or fathers who couldn't tell the truth. Just 2 people, tired and honest, standing too close in a small cabin that had suddenly stopped feeling small at all. "Elias." "I know," he said, and leaned in anyway, like the knowing didn't change what his body wanted to do about it. Their faces were inches apart when he stopped himself, so abruptly, it looked like it hurt. He stepped back, dragging a hand through his hair, putting the width of the cabin between them like distance alone could undo the last 30 seconds. "I can't," he said. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." Wren stood very still, the rejection landing somewhere raw, though underneath the hurt was something more patient, something that had learned, over the last 3 weeks, to wait for the real reason instead of the first one offered. "Can't or won't. Both. Neither. I don't know. He wouldn't look at her now, staring instead at the dark water through the cabin window like it might offer an easier explanation than the one sitting in his chest. My whole life, I've been the son who carries on what my father built. I don't know how to also be the man who falls for the one woman whose entire family my family may have destroyed to build it. It feels like wanting something I'm not allowed to have. Nobody's father gets to decide that for us, Elias. Maybe not. But I've spent 32 years believing this harbor only survives because one family made a hard choice the other couldn't afford to make. I don't know how to want something this much without being afraid of what it's going to cost this time, when we still don't even know the whole truth of what it cost the first time. Wren crossed the small distance between them again, slower now, deliberate, refusing to let him retreat fully behind a fear that wasn't really about her at all. Maybe your family was only ever told half the story about what that choice actually cost, she said. Maybe it wasn't the choice that ruined us both. Maybe it was the 18 years neither of our fathers spent saying the thing that actually needed saying. Elias looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes, a man standing at the exact edge of a decision he'd spent his whole life avoiding. For a moment she thought he might let himself stay in it. Instead, he stepped back again, gentler this time, and reached for the boat's ignition key like it was something solid to hold onto. I need time, he said quietly. Not because of you. Because of everything before you. Please. He guided the boat back toward the dock without saying much else, and Wren sat in the bow with her hand still faintly warm where his had been, watching the harbor lights come up slowly out of the dark, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that she had just come closer to something true than she had in years, on the same night the person standing across from her had chosen, once again, to walk away from believing he deserved to keep it. Renata Cole had a way of entering a room that made it feel like she'd always been standing in it. She came into the Vane Maritime office on a Tuesday morning with 2 coffees and a folder tucked under one arm, the same easy warmth she'd worn for 30 years in this harbor, greeting the front desk staff by name, complimenting the new signage, moving through the building like something that belonged to the walls themselves. Elias looked up from the licensing paperwork spread across his desk and felt, for reasons he couldn't yet name, the particular unease of a man watching something familiar from a new angle. You look like you haven't slept, she said, setting one of the coffees in front of him without asking if he wanted it. I heard about the reopened inquiry. I have to say, Elias, I was surprised you let it get this far. It's not really something I let happen. The Port Authority attached it to the licensing renewal. Renata settled into the chair across from him, unhurried, the folder still under her arm like something she wasn't ready to set down yet. And the Callahan girl.
Wren, is it?
I understand she's the one who brought all this back up. She had her father's black box data analyzed. There's a gap in the Helm record nobody's ever explained. Elias watched her face as he said it, some instinct he didn't fully trust telling him to pay attention to what didn't move as much as what did. You wrote the Meridian Star's policy, didn't you? Back then. I wrote half the policies in this harbor back then. It was a smaller book of business. She smiled, easy, unbothered, and took a sip of her own coffee. I imagine there's a great deal in 18-year-old data that looks strange out of context. Ships lose signal, instruments glitch, storms do things to electronics that never make it into a tidy report. I wouldn't put too much weight on it before you've had someone independent look at the whole file, not just the 90 seconds Miss Callahan wants you looking at. She's already had someone independent look at it. Something in Renata's expression shifted then, so briefly Elias almost missed it, not fear. Nothing so obvious as fear, but a kind of recalibration, the look of a woman quietly rerouting around an obstacle she hadn't accounted for. It was gone before he could be sure he'd seen it at all. Well, she said. Then I hope, for everyone's sake, that whatever it shows brings you some peace. Your father's carried this a long time. She opened the folder finally, sliding a single page across the desk toward him. In the meantime, I actually came about something else. The Port Authority's been quietly floating an exclusive salvage rights arrangement for the North Pier contracts, myself and a small consortium underwriting it. guaranteeing the harbor's coverage for the next 20 years in exchange for first refusal on all salvage work along that stretch. I wanted you to hear about it from me before you heard about it from them. Elias scanned the page, the careful legal language of it, the neat percentages. This would replace our standing contract. It would fold your standing contract into something larger. More stable, frankly, than the year-to-year arrangement your father's been running on for 2 decades. She said it gently, the way you'd explain something to someone you genuinely liked but had already decided couldn't be reasoned with any other way. I'd hate for a reopened inquiry into a wreck nobody can undo now to jeopardize something that actually protects this company's future, Elias. Your father's health isn't getting better. I'd think about what you actually want this company to look like when you're the only one steering it. That sounds like a threat dressed up as advice. It's just advice. Renata stood, gathering her own coffee, unhurried as ever. Old friends give it more freely than anyone else can afford to. Think about the timeline. The board's going to want an answer on this before your licensing renewal closes, one way or another. She paused at the door, and for a moment something behind her eyes went very still, very deliberate. And Elias, for what it's worth, I'd be careful how much of this you share with Miss Callahan before you've decided what you actually want out of it. Grief makes people reach for the nearest explanation that isn't their own family's fault. I'd hate to see you get pulled into hers. She was gone before he could answer, the door swinging shut behind her with a softness that felt, in retrospect, more unsettling than if she'd slammed it. Elias sat with the exclusive rights proposal in his hands for a long time after she'd left, the coffee she'd brought him going cold and untouched, turning over the particular wrongness of a conversation that had said all the right things and left him feeling, somehow, like he'd just been warned off something, without being told what. He found Wren an hour later going through the Port Authority's contract archive in the records room, sleeves rolled, a stack of decades-old filings spread across the table in front of her. She looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw on his face made her set down the page she was holding. What happened? Renata Cole happened, Elias said, and dropped the exclusive rights folder on the table beside her filings. I think she just told me, as politely as it's possible to say it, to stop looking at what you're looking at. Wren went very still. Then we're looking in the right place. Maybe. He pulled out the chair across from her, the unease still sitting cold in his chest, the particular vertigo of realizing a person he'd trusted his entire life might have been managing him the whole time he thought he was simply being cared for. Or maybe I just watched a woman my father has trusted for 30 years try to buy my silence with better paperwork than the last time she did it. Wren's eyes moved to the underlined name in the margin of the page still open in front of her, the same name, in her father's handwriting, that had started all of this. R. Cole. Ask why. I think it's time we finally do, she said. Wren found Marcus Vane alone on the boathouse porch the next morning, wrapped in a blanket against a chill that had more to do with illness than weather, watching the harbor with the particular stillness of a man who had run out of places to look that didn't hurt. Mr. Vane. I wondered when you'd come find me yourself. He didn't turn, but something in his shoulders loosened, as if her arrival were less an intrusion than a relief he'd been waiting on without letting himself admit it. Elias has been circling the question for 4 days now, softening it every time, out of some idea that being gentle with me means being gentle with the truth too. You won't do that. I can already tell. I don't have the luxury of being gentle with it. It's the only version of my father I've got left. Wren sat in the chair beside him, the wicker creaking under her weight, the harbor gray and moving beyond the rail. Renata Cole came to see Elias yesterday, offered him an exclusive rights deal and told him, in about as many words, to stop looking into what happened to the Meridian Star. Marcus's hand, resting on the arm of his chair, went very still. She always did know how to make a threat sound like a kindness. Then you know what she did. I know what I let her do. He said it quietly, without defense, the words of a man who had clearly rehearsed this confession alone for years and found it no easier now that someone was finally in the room to hear it. I've been telling myself a version of this story for 18 years that made me the man who protected his son from a company's collapse, instead of the man who let his oldest friend drown in a lie because it was easier than drowning with him. Tell me what actually happened. Marcus was quiet long enough that Wren thought he might retreat the way he had with Elias, the way she suspected he'd retreated from every version of this conversation for nearly 2 decades. Then he exhaled, slow and unsteady, and began. Renata underwrote half this harbor's marine policies by the time Silas and I were running our companies side by side. She'd handle my father's coverage before either of us took over, and by the time it came to us, nobody thought to question the arrangement. Why would you question something that had always simply been there? He shook his head slowly. It was Silas who noticed first. Payouts on vessels that didn't match their filed values. Coverage written in language that made no sense unless you assumed somebody intended a loss before it ever happened. He wanted to bring in an outside auditor, expose the whole thing before it sank us both. I told him to wait. I was afraid of what an audit would find attached to my own company's name. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong myself, guilt by proximity, the fear of a man who'd built his whole identity on being the responsible one. And the Meridian Star went down while you were still waiting. The Meridian Star went down, and 3 days later Renata came to me instead of the board. Told me she could contain it, the inquiry, the payout, the whole mess, if I let her manage what came next herself. Said if Silas kept pushing for that audit, the Marine Board would find both our companies tied to years of coverage neither of us fully understood, and neither company would survive what came after. She said the only way to protect both families was for one of us to step back quietly and let her handle the fallout. Marcus's hands had begun to shake, the old tremor Elias had described, grief and illness tangled together until neither one could be pulled fully free of the other. I told myself I was protecting my company, my son, this harbor's whole future. I didn't ask her what stepping back would actually cost Silas until it was already done, and by then there was a signed inquiry closing around a story that made him the villain, and I had already put my name on the paperwork that let it stand. Wren's throat had gone tight, the same 18 years of shame she'd carried cracking open again, this time into something that felt less like grief and more like the slow, cold arrival of understanding. You knew he didn't do it. I knew he tried to turn that ship back. I saw it in his face the last time we ever spoke before the harbor turned on him completely. Not a guilty man's face. A man who'd watched something happen he couldn't stop and didn't yet understand. Marcus finally turned to look at her, and what was in his face wasn't the careful composure Elias described from their earlier conversations. It was simply an old man's grief, unguarded at last, decades overdue. I let him carry that alone for 18 years, Wren, because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd let my oldest friend take a fall that was never his to take, and I didn't know how to live with that and still call myself the man my son believed I was. He's not going to stop believing that because of this, Wren said, quieter now, something in her loosening toward him despite everything. But he deserves to know the truth of who you actually are instead of the story you built to survive not telling him. I know. Marcus's voice had gone thin, the tremor in his hands worse now. There's more, Wren. Things Renata's still protecting that go well past what happened to your father. If she's circling Elias with contracts now, she's not doing it to guard an old secret. She's doing it because she's still profiting from the same arrangement she built 18 years ago, and she's about to lock it into place permanently before anyone thinks to look at it closely enough to stop her. Then tell me everything. All of it. Not the version that protects you, the version that stops her. Marcus Vane looked out at the harbor one more time, at water that had kept every one of his secrets far longer than he had any right to ask it to, and for the first time in 18 years, began to tell someone the truth in full. Elias found the eyewitness statement on a Thursday afternoon, buried 3 folders deep in the Marine Board's original inquiry file, the one the Port Authority had finally released to him under the Joint Review Clause. He almost skimmed past it. It was one page among hundreds, typed in the flat bureaucratic language of every other document in the box, a crew member's account of the night the Meridian Star went down, filed 2 weeks after the wreck, corroborating the story that had defined his family's fortune and buried Wren's for 18 years. The name at the bottom stopped him cold. Tomas Reyes. Elias knew every man who'd worked that boat. He'd grown up hearing their names the way other kids memorized batting averages. His father's crew, the men his family's whole legacy had supposedly been built on saving. Tomas Reyes had never been one of them. Elias had never heard the name in his life. He called Wren before he'd fully decided to. "I need you to come to the yard," he said, and something in his voice must have carried more than the words did, because she didn't ask why. She was there in 20 minutes, still in the boots she'd been wearing to walk the storm-damaged pier, hair pulled back loose and windblown. "What did you find?" He slid the statement across the desk without a word. She read it twice, the same way he had, her jaw tightening on the second pass. "Tomas Reyes," she said slowly. "That's not one of the Meridian Star's crew. I've read my father's old logs 100 times. He kept a full roster of every man who worked under him. There's no Reyes on it. I called the Harbor Association's records office an hour ago. There's no licensed deckhand named Tomas Reyes registered anywhere on this coast in the last 30 years. Elias's voice had gone flat, the particular stillness of a man watching the last support beam of a story give way all at once. Someone invented a witness, Wren. Someone typed up a statement, put a fake name on it, and slipped it into the official inquiry as if it came from a man who was actually standing on that deck. Wren sat down slowly, the statement still in her hand, 18 years of grief reorganizing itself around a fact simpler and uglier than anything she'd imagined. This is what closed the case. This is the thing that made my father the villain instead of a man the board couldn't fully explain. It's dated 2 weeks after the wreck. Right around the time you said Renata came to my father and told him she could contain the fallout herself. Elias pulled the page back toward him, scanning it again like it might reveal something new the third time through. She didn't just manipulate an insurance filing, Wren. She fabricated the evidence that sealed the inquiry. This is forgery. This is the thing that actually ends her if we can prove where it came from. Can we? The typewriter font doesn't match anything else in the file. Everything else from that period was typed on the Harbor Association's machine. There's a hitch in the lowercase E on every page except this one. He'd noticed it without quite registering why, the small anomaly nagging at him until Wren's question forced it into focus. This was typed somewhere else. On something else. If I can find the machine, or find someone who remembers Renata bringing in outside paperwork that year, we don't just have suspicion anymore. We have proof. Wren looked at the forged signature at the bottom of the page, a stranger's name standing in for 18 years of her father's ruined life, and felt something inside her go very quiet and very certain. My father spent the rest of his life being called a liar by a document that was never real in the first place. I know. Elias reached across the desk, not quite touching her hand, close enough that the gesture didn't need to finish itself to mean something. I'm sorry it took me this long to actually look. You're looking now. She said it without bitterness, something steadier in her voice than there had been in the boathouse office days earlier, a woman who had stopped waiting for someone else to hand her the truth and started building it herself, piece by piece, alongside him. That has to count for something. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through every remaining page of the inquiry file, cross-referencing typewriter marks, dates, filing stamps, the small mechanical fingerprints of a document that had been built to deceive rather than record. By the time the light through the boathouse windows had gone long and gold, they had 4 more pages that didn't belong, supporting exhibits, a supplemental report, all of it typed on the same machine, all of it filed within the same 10-day window, all of it stitched into the record so seamlessly that no one in 18 years had ever thought to pull the thread. She built the whole case, Wren said finally, quiet with the particular exhaustion of a person who had just watched an old grief become a solvable problem. Not just covered for someone else's mistake. She built it, start to finish, and let 2 families spend 18 years living inside the story she wrote. Then we take it apart the same way she built it, Elias said. Piece by piece, in front of everyone who ever believed it. Outside, the harbor had gone dark and still, the tide sliding quietly against the pilings, indifferent to the 18 years of silence it had kept without ever once being asked to. For the first time since Wren had come back to this town, the water didn't feel like something holding a secret. It felt like something waiting, finally, to give one up. The Port Authority's renewal hearing was never meant to be dramatic. It was usually a sleepy formality, A few signatures, a few nods, a few men in windbreakers pretending they weren't already thinking about lunch. But today the room felt like a storm cell, pressure building, airtight, everyone waiting for something they couldn't name but could feel. Wren Callahan stood near the back, clutching the folder that had become her entire world these past weeks. Elias Vane stood at the front table, jaw locked, shoulders squared, the posture of a man who had spent his whole life believing one story and was about to risk everything to tell another. Renata Cole sat between them, immaculate as ever. Her blazer was pressed, her hair perfect, her expression carved from stone. She had the confidence of someone who had already won, someone who believed the room belonged to her. The chair of the Port Authority cleared his throat. Next item. Review and approval of exclusive salvage rights renewal for Cole Maritime Insurance Liaison Services. Renata rose smoothly. Thank you, Chairman. As you know, my firm has provided 18 years of reliable service. A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone knew the number. 18 years. The same number of years since the Meridian Star went down. Wren felt her pulse hammering. Elias glanced back at her once. A silent question. Are you ready? She nodded. Renata continued. And with the new expansion of harbor operations, consolidating salvage oversight under a single authority will ensure efficiency, safety, and... Stop. Elias's voice cut through the room like a snapped cable. Renata froze mid-sentence. The chairman blinked. Mr. Vane, this is not the time. It's exactly the time. Elias stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. Before this board votes on giving Ms. Cole exclusive rights to the harbor, you need to see what she did to get here. Renata's smile didn't crack, but her eyes did. A flicker. A warning. Mr. Vane, she said calmly, I trust you're not about to repeat the slander Miss Callahan has been. It's not slander, Elias said. It's evidence. He opened the folder. The room leaned in. This, Elias said, lifting the first page, is the eyewitness statement that condemned Silas Callahan. The one that said he deliberately grounded the Meridian Star. The one that said my father's crew saw him do it. He held it up. Except none of them wrote this.
A gasp.
Someone whispered. What? Elias continued, voice steady, but shaking at the edges. I spoke to every surviving crew member. Not one of them gave the statement. Not one of them signed it. And the signature at the bottom. He pointed. Belongs to no one on the Meridian Star's manifest. Renata's jaw tightened. This is absurd. That document was verified by the Marine Board. No, Elias said. It was submitted to the Marine Board. By you. The chairman looked sharply at Renata. Miss Cole, is this true? Renata didn't blink. The board accepted the filing. That is all that matters. Wren stepped forward now, her voice clear and unwavering. Then maybe they should see the black box log too. She placed her own folder beside Elias's. The log shows my father trying to turn the ship back. Fighting the wheel. Fighting something overriding the controls.
He didn't sink that ship.
He tried to save it. The room erupted. Whispers, shock, disbelief. Renata's mask finally cracked. You don't understand the complexities of maritime insurance. No, Wren said. I understand exactly what you did. She turned to the board. July 22nd, 2026, 1938. Renata Cole falsified the eyewitness statement. She manipulated the insurance filings. She threatened Marcus Vane into silence. She built her career on a lie that destroyed my father's name and handed her control of this harbor. Marcus Vane, frail and pale, stood slowly from his seat in the front row. His voice trembled. She's telling the truth. Elias closed his eyes, the confirmation he'd needed and feared. Marcus continued. Renata came to me the night of the wreck. She said there were irregularities in my company's filings. She said if I didn't support her version of events, she'd expose them and ruin us. I let her rewrite the report. I let her bury Silas. I've lived with that shame for 18 years. The room fell silent. Renata finally snapped. Marcus, you old fool. Enough. Elias's voice was steel. You don't get to talk anymore. He turned to the board. You cannot give her exclusive rights. You cannot let her run this harbor. She built her empire on fraud. The chairman looked at Renata, then at the documents, then at the room full of people who had lived under the shadow of the Meridian Star for nearly 2 decades. Miss Cole, he said quietly, your request for exclusive salvage rights is denied. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Renata's face drained of color. Wren exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and grief. Silas Callahan was cleared. 18 years too late for him to hear it, but not too late for her. Elias stepped toward her, eyes soft for the first time since she'd returned to the harbor. You were right, he said. About everything. Wren swallowed. I didn't want to be right. I just wanted the truth. Elias nodded. Then let's make sure the harbor remembers it. The board members whispered among themselves, already discussing next steps, investigations, restructuring. But Wren and Elias stood still, the storm finally breaking around them. For the first time, the harbor felt like it was breathing again. The hearing ended, but the room didn't empty. People lingered in clusters, whispering, processing, recalibrating 18 years of belief. The Meridian Star had been the harbor's ghost, a story told so many times it became truth simply by repetition. Now the ghost had a new shape, and everyone seemed unsure how to look at it. Wren stepped outside into the salt, heavy air. The sky was clearing after the morning storm, streaks of gold cutting through the clouds like someone had taken a knife to them. She breathed in, letting the cold wind sting her lungs. For the first time since she was 18, the harbor didn't feel like it was pushing her out. It felt like it was waiting. Marcus Vane sat on a bench near the pier, cane resting against his leg, staring at the water. Wren approached slowly. He didn't look up. I should have told the truth, he said. I should have fought her. Silas deserved better. Wren sat beside him. You were scared. She made sure you were. Marcus nodded, eyes wet. He was my friend. Before all of this, we built half these docks together. And I let her bury him. Wren placed a hand on his. You didn't bury him. You just didn't know how to dig him back up. Marcus let out a shaky breath. Thank you for doing what I couldn't. She squeezed his hand once, gently. He'd forgive you. He always forgave, too easily. Marcus laughed, a small, broken sound. Elias, he'll need time. Wren looked toward the salvage yard, where Elias stood alone near the boats, hands on his hips, staring at the water like it had personally betrayed him. He'll figure it out, she said softly. Marcus nodded. He already has. He just doesn't know what to do with the pieces. Wren stood. Then I'll help him. Marcus's voice followed her as she walked away. You're good for him. Better than the lies we raised him on. Elias didn't turn when she approached. He didn't need to. She could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a steel hull. You okay? She asked. He exhaled sharply. I don't know what I am. Wren stepped beside him. You found the truth. That's something. It's everything, Elias said. And nothing. My father, he built his legacy on a lie. And I built mine on his. Wren looked at him. Then build something new. He finally turned to her, eyes raw. With you. She didn't flinch. If you want. Elias swallowed. I spent my whole life thinking I owed my father a debt for saving what your father destroyed. And now? Wren asked. And now I know he didn't want that debt paid. He wanted the truth to finally float back to the surface. Wren's breath caught. That's what we did today. Elias nodded. Yeah, we did. For a moment, neither spoke. The harbor creaked around them, ropes tightening, gulls calling, waves slapping against the pilings. Life continuing, even after everything had changed. Elias looked at the salvage boats. The board's going to restructure the contracts. Renata's out. They'll need someone to oversee operations. Wren raised an eyebrow. You volunteering? I was thinking, Elias hesitated. We could do it together. Vane and Callahan salvage. Both families. Both truths. Wren felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. You sure you want my name on your boats? I'm sure I want you on them, Elias said. She laughed softly. That's not the same thing. It is to me. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking like the tide pulling in. "You know," he said quietly, "I almost kissed you on the boat that night." "I know," she replied. "I almost let you." Elias's voice dropped. "I'm not pulling back this time." Wren didn't move.
Good.
"We're going to fix this place," he said. Wren smiled. "One truth at a time." Later that evening, the harbor gathered unofficially. People standing along the docks, talking, remembering, retelling the story they'd told for 18 years, but differently now. Silas Callahan's name was spoken without bitterness. Some apologized to Wren. Some simply nodded at her, the way people do when they're ashamed but grateful. The harbor remembered. Not the lie, the truth. And for the first time, Wren felt like she belonged here. Not as the daughter of a disgrace, but as the woman who brought the truth home. Elias stood beside her, fingers brushing hers, not quite holding, but close enough to promise he would. The Meridian Star had gone down 18 years ago, but tonight, something else finally surfaced.